Right, let me start talking about my research. The research project is somewhat unusual as it consists of three different elements: the composition of a novel of 65,000 words, a dissertation, which acts as both a commentary on the choices made in the writing and a consideration of the subject matter, as well as a more clinical investigation into possible parallels between aspects of the creative process and the onset of sleep. The project began, in effect, on a visit to an exhibition at the Wellcome Trust 9 years ago. The exhibition, titled Sleeping and Dreaming, included photographs of Nathaniel Kleitman's 1938 Mammoth Cave experiment, in which he and a colleague, Bruce Richardson, spent a month underground in order to monitor the relationship between sleep patterns and exposure to sunlight. Also on display were photographs of Peter Tripp, a New York DJ, and Randy Gardner, a student from San Diego, who in 1959 and 1964 managed to stay awake for 201 and 264 hours, respectively. 264 hours translating into 11 straight days without sleep. Seeing these photographs now, the image of Kleitman and Richardson going about their daily duties in a network of caves feels like a fitting metaphor for the state of sleep, otherworldly, impenetrable. But it's Peter Tripp and Randy Gardner and their experiments that seem to have preoccupied me ever since. I imagine I see in them a possible bridge between consciousness and unconsciousness, an amplification of what is usually a relatively brief period known as hypnagogia, when we first enter the foothills of sleep. Years ago, a friend of mine nodded off on the sofa beside me, and when he started muttering to himself, I decided to try and engage him in what turned out to be a rather abstract conversation. My sense at the time was that my friend was reporting back from, if not the subterranean world of sleep itself, then at least the tunnels leaning towards it. Similarly, on the few occasions when I've been jolted out of the earliest stages of sleep's onset, convinced that I was still thinking rather than dreaming, I've come around to see quite how irrational my thoughts have been, and on occasion been able to retrace my thoughts back to the point where they left the tracks and began to head off into the dark. As a novelist, I've long held the view that the act of writing embraces both the creative and the critical, one's point of view on the material alternating, often moment by moment, between the two perspectives. And while I'm much more an advocate of perspiration over inspiration, I do sometimes detect, particularly during a project's early stages, when exploring the options available to a narrative, a momentary slackening of my hold on the reins of rational thinking, to find an apparently novel thought or connection has been thrown up from what feels like the deeper recesses of my mind. So might it be possible, I wondered, to consider the hypnagogic state through which we daily pass on our way to sleep, alongside certain aspects of the creative process, and if not draw direct comparisons, then at least ask if the study of the former might inform our understanding of the latter. This time last year, I decided that Peter Tripp and or Randy Gardner would act as the novel's protagonists. I began researching the period during which their wake-a-thons, as they were known, took place. David Halberstam's The 50s, Richard Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style in American Politics, The Lonely Crowd, The Organization Man. Our broad sense of the United States in this period is of a country whose economy is beginning to flourish, whilst psychically the nation brims with anxiety, an anxiety which found its focus in communism, and not least the possibility of it inveigling its way into American society. Spies and spy rings, it seemed, were everywhere, and in order to counter them, secret agents had to be dispatched. By the 1950s, Herbert Philbrick and Matt Svetich gained a certain notoriety after admitting having infiltrated the Communist Party at local level on behalf of the FBI. If Peter Tripp has since come to be portrayed as surly and unstable, and the younger Randy Gardner as keen and reliable. So Philbrick and Svetic, let me just find him, would find themselves personified in similarly opposing terms. Philbrick, by dint of his good relations with the FBI and his reluctance to put himself on show, became diligent and unassuming. Svetic, spurned by the FBI, sold his story to the newspapers, where his activities were, unsurprisingly, presented in heroic terms. His exploits were then serialized on the radio and eventually adapted into a film, I Was a Communist for the FBI. Each adaptation nudging the protagonist ever closer to the status of a demigod. Thus, Svetic has come to be regarded as self-aggrandizing, delusional even. The more I read, the more I began to see parallels between Tripp and Gardner's efforts in exploring the outer reaches of the unconscious, and Svetic and Philbrick's infiltration of the unions of Pittsburgh and party activity in Massachusetts. Might it not be possible, I wondered, for one set of characters to exist in my novel alongside the other? Around the same time, I was discovering that a primary obstacle in creating a narrative about the Wake-a-thons is the fact that Tripp and Gardner's attempts occurred 5 years apart. Of course, I could fictionalize events, I'm a fiction writer, and have the two attempts take place simultaneously in a contest to see who could stay awake the longest. After all, one of the reasons I'd originally been drawn to the story of the Wake-a-thons was because they seemed to have echoes of the dance marathon in Horace McCoy's 1935 novel, They Shoot Horses, Don't They? But my fascination was also in how human beings behave in extreme circumstances, what we reveal about ourselves at the point when we begin to fall apart. In their sleep-deprived state, both men experienced hallucinations, or what the British sleep scientist James Horne insists on referring to as misperceptions. Randy Gardner looked out at a garden and saw plants that didn't exist. At one point, Peter Tripp, spooked by the entrance of a stranger, panicked, ran out of the Manhattan studio and was almost hit by a bus. Worse, weeks after the experiment, Tripp became convinced that he was not in fact the real Peter Tripp at all, but an imposter. There was no shortage of potential psychological drama, but in physical terms, it was hard to escape the fact that my protagonists were, for the most part, simply killing time whilst doing their damnedest to stay awake. I could flash forward to the same characters in their dotage and flash back to significant moments in their childhood, have Tripp or Gardner imagine themselves as secret agents. But my instinct was and remains that once the reader establishes that any adventures in the narrative will ultimately turn out to be hallucinatory, they'll grow suspicious and find it harder to invest emotionally in the character's predicament. So I moved on. At some point I noticed how many groundbreaking psychological and social experiments had taken place in this period, certainly from the 60s through to the early 70s. Stanley Milgram's experiment in obedience at Yale, in which volunteers were instructed to administer electric shocks to fellow volunteers. The Stanford prison experiment, whose participants were given roles either as prisoners or prison guards in order to try and attain whether their behavior was situational or dispositional. And the Concord and Marsh Chapel experiments led by Timothy Leary and Richard Albert at Harvard, in which psilocybin, the psychedelic compound in magic mushrooms, was given to prisoners and divinity students. Peter Tripp's Wake-a-thon was instigated, in part at least, to raise money for charity, whilst Randy Gardner's effort was given a veneer of clinical propriety by having his college buddies, Joe Marciano and Bruce McAllister, clutch their clipboards whilst observing him doing press-ups and tapping his knee to test his reflexes. But from our perspective, 50 years on, the experiments carried out at Harvard, Yale, and Stanford were not significantly better regulated. And yet all of these pale into insignificance compared with the covert CIA-backed mind control program, now collectively referred to as Project MK-Ultra, an attempt to develop a series of drugs and procedures to be employed in interrogations and generated in part as a response to the treatment of American POWs in North Korea. The experiments ran for decades, carried out on a range of individuals, some of them CIA employees, but also prisoners, mental patients, and even women suffering postnatal depression, often without consent. However, one person who did consent to be a guinea pig for one aspect of the research at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital in California was the writer Ken Kesey, who was studying and teaching at the time at Harvard. He was given several doses of LSD and found it to be revelatory, so much so that after the trials, when he worked part-time at the same institute as a nurse's aide, he managed to track down some of the drugs that had been used in the research and took them home for his own recreational use. LSD fueled the infamous bus trip Kesey and his merry band of pranksters took across the United States to the World's Fair at New York City. In the electric Kool-Aid acid test, Tom Wolfe's commentary on the bus ride, Wolfe talks of Kesey and pals combining speed and grass to prop that LSD door open. Indeed, Kesey's novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, can be read as an odyssey of a supposedly sane man, Randall McMurphy, down into the asylum of the unconscious and ultimately failing to return. Kesey's experiences as a guinea pig and the scope of his adventures in America felt more applicable to my narrative. And over the summer, I found that my protagonists had gone from 2 to a possible 4 down to 2 again before being distilled to a single one. A character who, having volunteered to be a guinea pig in an experiment into sleep deprivation, is beginning to suspect that things are not quite what they seem. More recently, I've shifted the novel's setting, effectively leaving Tripp and Gardner behind, if not their experiences. I find that I'm writing some sort of thriller. Accordingly, my reading has shifted from Lauren Singer's The Parallax View, James Grady's 6 Days of the Condor, and Richard Condon's The Manchurian Candidate, to more contemporary work, Lee Child, Karen Slaughter, Gillian Flynn. I shouldn't be surprised to discover that some bestsellers are highly readable. But some of the prose in Flynn's Dark Places and Gone Girl is among the best fiction I've encountered in several years. Whilst developing various aspects of the novel, I've also started my research into possible links between the writing process and the onset of sleep. In a Paris Review interview I read some years ago, Joseph Heller talked about his ideas coming to him during the course of a sort of controlled daydream, a directed reverie. And in the last few days, I've come across a book by Andreas Mavromatis on hypnagogia, in which he quotes Arthur Koestler, saying that the creative act presupposes a relaxing of the controls and regression to modes of ideation which are indifferent to the rules of verbal logic, unperturbed by contradiction, untouched by the dogmas and taboos of so-called common sense, and that at the decisive stage of discovery, the codes of disciplined reasoning are suspended. The neurologist Oliver Sacks has noted that there is something about the rapid and spontaneous transformations specific to hypnagogic imagery that suggests the brain is idling. Neuroscientists now tend to speak of all default networks in the brain which generate their own images. Perhaps one may also venture the term play and think of the visual cortex playing with every permutation, playing with no goal, no focus, no meanings, a random activity, or perhaps activity with so many micro-determinants that no pattern is ever repeated. Few phenomena give such a sense of the brain's creativity and computational power as the almost infinitely varied, ever-changing torrent of patterns and forms which may be seen in hypnagogic states. The composition of a novel, indeed of a single sentence, presents the writer with a near infinite variety of choices. The trick, as Robert McKee points out, is finding the correct path. Although any certainty about identifying the right path over the wrong one may only emerge in retrospect. McKee's entire perspective towards the creative act is, in my opinion, retrospective. At the moment of decision, the writer can do no better than speculate with confidence and determination. But Oliver Sacks's notion of play rings true for me. Speaking to a friend earlier this year, who happens to be a psychologist, I mentioned how, when I have a large ongoing project, I'll often find myself tinkering with other unformed projects in the margins. My wife has claimed that if I were to direct the energy expended on such nascent projects to the project before me, I might well double my output. But my psychologist friend is more charitable, suggesting that the early stages of creative development might provide me with the time and space in which to play. A simple observation that has felt more convincing with every passing week. The American psychologist Charles E. Schaeffer, founding father of play therapy, talks of creativity as being a lowering of ego controls so that fantastic and primitive associations arise to the consciousness. It's no coincidence, I think, that the point of my creative process which I feel has most in common with hypnagogia is the primary and decidedly abstract thinking, the briefest of periods which one might sometimes refer to as brainstorming, in which all elements are considered and available, and therefore quite the opposite of the project which is already developed and in which compromises and constraints are visible. In fact, this element of play during the earliest stages is the closest I come in my practice to inspiration, the 99% of perspiration commencing the moment I return to myself. Thomas Edison, who came up with the phrase, in relation, it should be said, to the concept of genius rather than creativity, was a notoriously hard worker who claimed he could survive quite happily on 4 hours sleep a day. And yet Edison sometimes found more abstract, tangential thinking difficult, and when he was stuck on a problem, would doze in an armchair whilst clutching a steel ball in each hand. The moment he nodded off, his hands would release the balls and wake him, hopefully revealing some insight into his work. Similarly, Robert Louis Stevenson used to lie in his bed with his elbows on the mattress beside him and his hands in the air at 90 degrees. When he nodded off, his hands would hit the bed, bring him round, and again, hopefully provide access to his unconscious processes. Salvador Dali is said to have held a spoon above a metal plate whilst encouraging himself to nod off with similar intentions. And the Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev apparently grasped how to arrange the elements into the periodic table whilst dozing in a chair. But I should state again that my interest is not in the notion of hypnagogia as a state where the creative writer might venture in order to shake off his or her mental shackles, although I don't doubt that some writers might employ it as such. My interest is in the notion that qualities to be found in the hypnagogic state might also be found in certain aspects of a writer's process. The simplest method of making the comparison would be to monitor blood flow in the brain with an MRI scan or the electrical signals with an EEG monitor. First for hypnagogia, and again for an individual at the significant part of their creative process. But whilst there is no shortage of available data relating to sleep's onset, when it comes to creativity, different studies suggest different parts of the brain effectively light up depending what sort of creativity the subject is partaking in and what part of the process they find themselves. Thinking creatively, unsurprisingly, is not limited to a single domain, but is a process incorporating many parts. The aspect of creative writing that interests me, and which I suspect of sharing facets with hypnagogia, is so particular and so very fleeting that I've yet to find a study that has covered it. In one respect, of course, I find this encouraging, as it suggests that my research in terms of psychological data may well be uncharted territory, and may justify me setting up with Dr. Jones, my supervisor from the psychology department, some sessions in which I get to have electrodes attached to my head and have my neurological activity monitored on an EEG machine. But working on this paper has obliged me to review my intentions, to ask myself whether my goals are the same as they were this time last year. It may be perfectly possible to establish commonalities between hypnagogia and creativity, but ultimately, what does that change or prove? I don't anticipate employing this understanding as a way of accessing a freer method of writing. Don't expect it to change my attitude to my work. Certainly, I'm in favor of creative writing being taken more seriously as an enterprise, a subject worthy of study, a subject it is possible to teach. And yet I'm also happy to allow that certain aspects of the creative process would and perhaps should remain a mystery. As I've said before, my natural inclination is in favour of the benefits of sustained work, research, development, rewriting, what one might call the perspirational elements. I certainly wouldn't want the results of my research to reinforce the notion of writing as a cerebral or romantic recreation. But I do find myself returning to the image of an individual wired up to an EEG machine. I'm beginning to see that part of my fascination with the 50s and 60s is the clinical paraphernalia. And to the outsider, an EEG machine looks suspiciously like a polygraph, or what we still insist on calling a lie detector. We remain convinced that there is such a thing as truth and a means of identifying it, either with a machine or drugs. In the creation of a piece of fiction, the writer and reader are involved in a conspiracy to con the polygraph. But working on this paper, I also appreciate that I feel a certain affinity with Tripp and Gardner. It may be easy to mock their efforts, but they exist as part of a long line of self-experimenters, which would certainly include a writer like Ken Kesey. Without wishing to sound too grand, I'm inclined to propose that writing too is an act of self-experimentation, of self-exploration and ideally revelation. And so if the image of Kleitman and Richardson deep underground at Mammoth Cave can act as a metaphor for sleep and the unconscious mind, I'm beginning to wonder whether the image of a man or woman hooked up to an EEG machine might somehow represent the creative act. Thank you.